Howdy folks, welcome back to the Steampunk Desperado channel. This week's show is number 4 in my series about wokeness in science fiction. With the rise of the transgender movement and its ideology, there was a sudden demand for transgender stories of all sorts. Of course, it was not so much market demand as a dogmatic insistence by media platforms and our intellectual classes that it should be produced for reasons of leftist virtue. In the last few years, I've encountered a number of stories with gratuitous transgender characters, and you think, why did they throw this in here? I've also heard about, of course, a number of mainstream trans movies like Amelia Perez, which was nominated for just about every award in the universe. But are there any specifically transgender science fiction novels out there? I pose this question to the all-knowing oracle, in this case, Grok AI. Quoting his reply, here are some notable science fiction and fantasy novels that feature a transgender principal character as a protagonist or a central figure, or the center gender transition as a primary or significant theme. That's a mouthful. All of these were recent, and I hadn't heard of a single one. Only one of the authors was familiar to me. Then I went through the dates and the publishers. Most were major publishers, and the dates larger from 2015 to 2020. So it seemed like there was a very particular period where it was super popular, kind of like steampunk was in the early 2010s. But will it be around for the long haul? Will it have the popular support to sustain it? Today I'll talk about some of those books that Grok recommended to me, and I'll give you my predictions and my logic behind them. Woke Storytelling Part 4. Transgender science fiction is doomed. 4 reasons why. When I speak about transgender stories, I'm not looking for cross-dressing comedies like the movies Tootsie or Victor Victoria, which both came out in 1982, believe it or not. There were also a handful of trans-themed movies in the following decade, including the crime drama The Crying Game, 1992, and the rock musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which appeared in Off-Broadway in 1998. But in those cases, the transgender element was kind of a gimmick, not the real central theme of the work. As I said, this list of transgender stories that Grok gave me were all pretty recent, so I asked it about earlier works. Now, I use Grok because I expect it to be less biased. So of course, its source is the internet itself, which is biased to begin with, so you can't really get around it. Regarding the older works, many, if not most of them, had been criticized for portraying transgenderism in a negative, stereotypical, caricature, or transphobic light. In these works, trans themes were often used as a plot device for shock, horror, comedy, or social commentary, rather than the respectful representation of the movement. Interesting wording there. So, this is my working definition of transgender fiction. It's about affirming positive portrayals of the movement, in particular works by transgender and non-binary authors. They count double. Of the 12 transgender science fiction or fantasy works that Grok recommended, I read 5, all published since 2015. And I did not look up their authors, though sometimes from the names, it's a little suspicious. You think this name is probably something that replaced the old dead name. The first of these books was The Black Tides of Heaven from Tor 2017 by Neon Yang. In this book, children are born androgynous and choose their sex whenever they feel ready, and it gets confirmed by the priests, so you wonder if there's some sort of a actual transition going on here. The main characters are identical twins. One ends up male and one female. As in many novels by lefty authors, they are fighting the oppressive system, whose leader just happens to be their own mother. By the way, Grok describes this book as belonging to the silkpunk subgenre, which appears to be an Asian version of steampunk. Next, I read The Four Profound Weaves from Tantor 2020 by R.B. Lemberg, which takes place in a desert world with rigid sex roles where characters can transition with the help of mystical beings. I've noticed this kind of fascination with desert societies in some of these books, and I'm not quite sure why that is. The protagonist of this book are called weavers because they can weave magic carpets out of sand and bones and song and other interesting impractical materials. So it's got to be metaphorical, but I just couldn't picture it. The third novel is An Unkindness of Ghosts, 2017, Akashic Publishing by Rivers Solomon. Now, this is a space opera with a black grievance theme. Trans elements are there, but they seem to result from oppression. For example, the female protagonist, she has herself sterilized preemptively, likely due to fear of sexual violence. The only positively portrayed man in the book wants to be a woman. Do I sense an anti-male bias on the author's part? Don't know. The next one, Full Fathom 5 by Max Gladstone, is part 3 in a fantasy series involving a priestly consulting agency in this interesting uh, fantasy-based universe that has multiple gods. And this priest agency, they intercede with these gods. They handle the sacrifices and all that, and the prayers and all that business. Prayers for hire, I guess. It's an interesting world. One major character, in fact, the major character, happened to have been transformed from a man to a woman, but that's in the backstory. It didn't happen in the book. This character is a woman this entire time. In the fifth book, Starless, 2018 Tor, author Jacqueline Carey takes a different approach. Now, she's the only author of this bunch that I've heard of before. Her fantasy work centers on a warrior girl who was raised as a boy by monks in a completely male society. So she actually doesn't know she's a girl. And she is the chosen of the gods, and she becomes the bodyguard and lover of a physically handicapped princess. Well written, I thought, but the trans element is totally contrived. Now, I had to read at least one from the bad old days when the trans was being mocked or misused. And that one was The Passion of New Eve, 1977, published by Galance, written by Angela Carter. Now, it so happened I'd heard that her works were cited by a fellow steampunk author as an inspiration for his work. So I figured, yeah, I better read her. This novel turned out to be a cringy feminist revenge fantasy, perhaps satirical, perhaps not, in which a misogynistic young man is forcibly made into a woman in a bizarre apocalyptic America, which was portrayed a lot at that time. So everybody thought the world was going to end in 1975. What did this man do? He impregnated the girl and abandoned her. So, doing that, that'll show him. Interesting that in the book, after he's converted, he also becomes pregnant, or she becomes pregnant. This one is politically incorrect, I guess, maybe because the main character is transitioned against his will. Or maybe it's because the story embodies kind of a premise that's featured in a certain type of pornography. Not that I'd know anything about that, not at all. Now, this was an interesting journey reading these 6 books. Some of the protagonists were trans men, some trans women, and none were particularly non-binary. I don't know if that's just uninteresting or what the deal is with that. I sense a different spin for the two types. Trans women stories are more about emotion and longing, while the trans man characters are more about confronting oppression. I did enjoy 2 of them, Starless and Full Fathom 5, though I wouldn't rank either among my favorites, and I wouldn't consider either of them to be particularly transgender centered. The others, not so much. And not necessarily because of the trans themes. In particular, The Unkindness of Ghosts had the ridiculous premise of a multi-generation colony starship was structured like an antebellum slave plantation. Seriously, the whites are in charge. They live in the upper decks. The black people all live below. They have to do all the grunt work. They're bossed around and beaten by overseers who are gratuitously cruel. Of course they are. I think the author kudos, though, because her writing style is very nice. There's some really creative and rich language, even if I don't like the story so much. Plus, She uses the word themself instead of themselves for a non-specific singular pronoun. Because some of the decks are gender fluid. She doesn't really explain why. In short, I wasn't all that impressed with any of these books. And that's part of the reason for my prediction. You can quote me on it. Sci-fi novels with affirming portrayals of transgenderism are largely going to disappear within the next 5 years. Not that trans stories will go away entirely, nor should they. I don't believe in censorship, but I'm sure the people will self-publish them. There'll be little boutique publishers they'll bring these things out. But I don't see the majors, if they still exist, being so obsessed with it. I mean, what's the point? They don't really make money. People, for the most part, aren't interested. So I see that trend as ending. I say this not to be cruel because I have nothing against trans people. I believe we should leave them alone to live their best lives, as J.K. Rowling so aptly put it. Nonetheless, here are my reasons that I think transgender sci-fi is doomed. Reason number one, as we've seen in these 6 books, there's not really a coherent message to these things. That's what really struck me, that the rock list had this thrown together feel, like there's anything that's even slightly transgender in there. So maybe think maybe there isn't all that much to begin with, even right now at the height of the mania. In short, these books didn't have a lot in common with each other. In some cases, the gender transition idea was central to the book. In other cases, it was like a virtue signaling embellishment. In a work like Full Fathom 5, for example, the main character was once a man, but he was magically transformed into a she, a bona fide woman, complete with all the working parts, indistinguishable from somebody who had been born that way. In this situation, what does the history matter? The problem, I shouldn't have to say this, but the problem with transgenderism is that in the real world, for the vast majority of individuals, that's not the case. That's why they so fervently insist that we have to pretend along with them. Reason number two is the interidentity conflicts of the woke world. For several years now, transgenderism has enjoyed a place at the top of the victim hierarchy, which is what wokeness is all about, right? True feminists who, like, here she is again, J.K. Rowling, actually advocate for women. And they've gotten a lot of heat from the transgender mafia. They object to biological men invading their private spaces. Now, it's practically a federal offense for a straight man to tell an off-color joke in front of a female coworker because that makes her feel kind of uncomfortable. But it's totally okay for a biological male to sit naked in front of her in a nude spa because he's really a she. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Of course, trans athletes have pretty much destroyed women's sports wherever they've entered it because if you're born a male, you have an advantage. Sorry, that's the truth. Then there are the Muslims, though I don't believe Islam is compatible with the West. I agree with them on this. Muslim parents are totally justified in wanting to keep their kids away from this transgender type of propaganda. If they have that right, so do we. Finally, of course, other ethnic minorities aren't so happy about it either. I recall a black YouTuber ranting about how he hated the trans movement feminizing young black men, and I can't say I disagree with him. Reason number three, economic factors. As I was alluding to earlier, despite the accolades that these transgender books receive from mainstream critics, I have to wonder how much is genuine. I mean, from what I can tell from when querying Grok, uh, these kind of books aren't that popular, and the recent transgender movies that have come out, they really haven't made a profit. In other words, they're virtue signaling, and they're pandering to the ideologues at the top of these companies. We've all noticed the huge disparity between critic scores and audience scores on sites like Rotten Tomatoes. It's all about the economic power of mainstream platforms, both the publishers and the studios, who expect critics to go along with the ideology or, be marginalized. You don't get access anymore. Sorry, buddy. You don't want to challenge them, in other words. But that business is changing. Mainstream publishers aren't doing so well. And that's one of the reasons the companies have been consolidating. We are entering an age when self-published writers and indie publishing platforms will be a serious competition. So they're going to have to mend their ways. In any case, as mainstream publishing declines, the incentive to produce woke works of fiction will shrink to what the market will actually support, which I suspect is much less than the current day, much closer to the real transgender population, which will be less than 1%. Finally, reason number 4, the changing consensus. A few months ago, I did a video about the portrayal of psychic phenomena in science fiction. In the 1950s and 1960s, when many scientists believed that psychic abilities were real and that science just had to prove them, there would be things about ESP and telekinesis popping up in practically every sci-fi story. As time went on and it was debunked, which is sad, but it was debunked, this became much rarer. The same will hold true with transgenderism, which the medical and psychiatric communities both support. Note that gender identity disorder was rebranded by the American Psychiatric Association as gender dysphoria, sounds much more neutral, back in 2013. And the new term only applies when the transgender person experiences distress, not about the delusion itself. I predict that as we see the continuing harm stemming from affirmation of transgenderism, especially for children, that will change. More to the point, I don't see transgenderism making a lot of sense in science fiction, at least not in the ones that portray a positive future. So we don't see a lot of people in wheelchairs in Star Trek. Medical science can cure these conditions. I wasn't even sure why Geordi LaForge had to wear the visor. You would think they could have given him new eyes. Similar transgenderism will be different in the future, and I see one of two options. First is to assume that there's a technology for perfect medical biological transition, as in Samuel R. Delaney's book, Trouble on Triton. The other option, which I think is more likely in the real world, but not as interesting, is that the mental condition will be curable. Yes, I know it's heresy, but I'm advocating conversion therapy. Remember that famous South Park episode where Kyle undergoes surgery to make himself tall and black so he can be a better basketball player? It all goes wrong, and the point is that it was better for him to accept being short and white, which is what he really is. By the way, the U.S. Supreme Court very recently just struck down the Colorado state law against conversion therapy. So counselors will be allowed to say, are you sure you really want to transition? Could there be some other problem that's causing you to want this? I'm not advocating forcing anybody to be reprogrammed. Unless, of course, you're a criminal and we can program the violence out of you. Probably won't work, but it would be great if it would. But considering the alternative, I've done some research into medical surgical transition. It sounds pretty horrifying. Again, I have nothing in principle against the person changing sex. But with the current technology, it simply isn't possible. This is my show about the future of transgender stories in science fiction. Please let me know what you think about it in the comments. Please like and subscribe. Please also check out my works on Amazon. Links are in the description, and I'm continuing to work on that military science fiction, making steady progress, continuing to work on that, and that will be out on the web soon in both written and audio form. By the way, stay tuned for my next show when we'll be taking a break from constant wokeness to do an idea that was suggested by commenter Anon-person 3972. Now, does that mean anonymous person or a non-person? Just wondering. In any case, he or she had a great suggestion that I should do a list of my top 10 based books, that is non-woke science fiction. Look for that in 2 weeks or so, maybe a week if I'm feeling ambitious. This has been the Steampunk Desperado saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.